All right, so our final speaker will be Saeed, who is a lecturer at the Department of Classical and Modern Languages and Literatures and Cultures at Wayne State University in Detroit. And the title of his paper is Postnationalism and its Discontents, Moral Panic and the Development of Muslimophobia in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to the organizers for having me here. I know you're all hungry, and I hate to be the one keeping you from lunch, but if you'll indulge me just for 20 minutes, I'll make it worth your while, hopefully. I'd like to take you back to about a year ago with the re-election of President Obama in the United States, and just to give you some insight as to what were some of the voices, because there were quite a few voices on television that night. Here we have an epiphany, a revelation that was realized by Fox News' own Bill O'Reilly, saying that the white establishment is now the minority, and the voters, many of them, feel that the economic system is stacked against them. So very negative language. You're going to see a tremendous Hispanic vote for President Obama, overwhelming black vote, and women will probably break President Obama's way. The demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore. We also have Rush Limbaugh, his much louder, larger, and more bombastic colleague, who said that he went to bed last night thinking we're outnumbered. I went to bed last night thinking we've lost the country. I don't know how else you look at this. Pat Buchanan, himself a former presidential candidate, had said that when the demography moving against the GOP, meaning the Republican Party in the U.S., with more Americans becoming dependent on governments, he's correlating those two together, it will take leadership not yet visible to rescue the Republican Party from the fate Barack Hussein Obama. And of course he mentions his middle name here. Of course it's rather ironic given mentioning Hussein. I think Buchanan is waiting for the Mahdi, the Messiah, to come back to save the GOP. And again, we find that this coalescence of various categories in American demographics, Latinos, Black Americans, women, etc., are seen by some in one political corner as leading to the destruction of the America that they know, a traditional white America. Well, this all flows into then what Cohen describes in Folk Devils and Moral Panics as moral panic. When a condition, episode, person, or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. And the question that I ask is, are Muslims then seen as the epitome of moral panic? And is then Muslimophobia in America the meta-panic that is plaguing the country? Many Muslims in America think that Muslimophobia, or Islamophobia if you will, is a unique, an isolated phenomenon unattached to any of the other forces that are underway in America. And my contention is that if there is an impending crisis in the US, that Islamophobia or Muslimophobia is not the moral panic, it is not the meta-panic, but in fact there are several or multiple panics affecting America, leading then to a different meta-panic. So let's go through a few of these, if you will. We have the following narrative preservation occurring, and this is quite literally hot off the presses. This is from Megyn Kelly, a host on Fox News, and if you notice, a lot of these are from Fox News. And by the way, for all you kids watching at home, Santa just is white. But just because it makes you feel uncomfortable doesn't mean it has to change. Jesus was a white man too. Jesus was a white man too. It's like he's a historical figure, that's a verifiable fact, as is Santa. I just want kids to know that. How do you revise it in the middle of the legacy in the story and change Santa from white to black? Well, just in case you're too caught in the legacy, here is St. Nicholas on the left, and of course, lovable Santa Claus that Megyn Kelly wants to preserve as a meme on the right. St. Nicholas, as you know, coming from the Caucasus. And in case you also weren't paying attention, Jesus the Palestinian, Jesus the Teutonic in this picture. So of course, Kelly wants to preserve the ones on the right and ignore and dismiss the reality of the ones on the left. This plays into what statistics are now showing over the last few years as being a final countdown for those who are quite anxious. Last year, according to the US Census, was the first year where non-white births exceeded non-Hispanic white births. We're finding now that there are already several majority-minority states, or the equivalent: Hawaii, California, New York, Texas, and of course Washington, D.C. We also find that the largest minority group in the U.S. is the Hispanic population. It is the largest growing, or the fastest growing minority group, and in fact is now eclipsing the previous group, Black Americans. We also find that the United States is going through a paradigm shift when it comes to its religious identity, religious affiliation. According to the Pew Center, America, for the first time in its history, is no longer a majority Protestant nation. We find that the largest group that has risen the quickest is the nuns, not nuns with the habit, Julie Andrews' Sound of Music, but those who profess no religious affiliation. This is a statistic or a category or a slide that shows the largest non-Christian groups by region. And Islam is now the second largest group in 20 of the American states. Interestingly, Hinduism is the second largest religion in Delaware and Arizona. And then we also find Buddhism has quite a stronghold in other states, as does Judaism with 15 of the 50 states as well, the largest non-Christian groups. America is also moving in the next 30 years to becoming a majority-minority country, less white, less Anglo-Saxon, and less Protestant. So basically less like Santa Claus, less like Jesus. And we find that by these years, various age groups from within these will already have reached their status as being the majority demographic within that respective age group. So this is creating quite a bit of clamor. Before he died, Samuel Huntington left us with Who Are We?, which was foreboding and decrying the loss of his beloved essentialized American identity of being white Anglo-Saxon Protestant to becoming less white, more brown, less Anglo-Saxon, more Latin American, less Protestant, more Catholic, so going from WASP to black. What I contend then is that America is going through with the meta-panic of the demographic shift toward majority-minority, a system of multiple panics in the area of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, economics, as well as what could be argued as the perceived Muslim menace. Just to look over at the European context, I would argue that looking at some of the statements that have been made by various politicians here, this actually is a French politician, of course, Jean-François Copé, talking about why it is necessary to ban the veil. We have, okay, so this is a slide. We also have, in the case of Swiss opposition to Muslims, minaretophobia, where the minaret has nothing to do with religion. It symbolizes a place where Islamic law is established. Incidentally, of course, we have the example of Streich, who saw the light apparently and converted to Islam in Switzerland. We have, of course, also, along with Islam, other panics plaguing Europe. The Eurozone crisis, for example, blaming the pigs. Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And the language, of course, in some of the newspapers, whether it is the Financial Times or whether it is in Bild, I won't try to even say it in the German, but are Greeks and Spaniards ruining the euro? As well as a lot of allusions to the idea that don't trust Greeks bearing debts is something else that was found in the newspapers. And in fact, at a gathering of EU members 2 years ago in Brussels, after many of the officials had a few drinks in them, they made it a point of recognizing that the real reason why the pigs were causing the euro to collapse was because they shared in common their non-Protestant legacy, or heritage, sorry. The fact that Portugal, Italy, and Spain, respectively, are all Catholic, and that Greece is Orthodox. Because conveniently absent from the narrative was the country which began the financial crisis, Iceland. So the idea about the viability of the Eurozone, the viability or the universality of Enlightenment values. If you want to really be very optimistic, we have Jürgen Habermas, who says that Enlightenment hasn't failed, it's just that modernity is just incomplete. To looking at Foucault, who of course had less faith in the Enlightenment model. So these multiple panics then inform the way that Europe also looks at Muslims. in framing the debates, that it is not just a matter of race, it is not just a matter of institutionalization, there is also Islamophobia by deflection. Getting back to the demographic shift in the United States, or what I would borrow from some of the papers I read looking at the Greek crisis, Sisyphus reborn. Is there a way for those who are trying to preserve the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant demography of the United States a futile exercise? Is this a boulder that simply keeps rolling back down the hill? Well, we look on a state level, not on a federal level, but in each of the 50 states, how have the legislatures in each of these states looked at issues on these grounds? Well, I took a look at voter ID or voter suppression laws, focusing and targeting race, immigration restriction laws, focusing ethnicity, particularly Latinos, Hispanics, looking at laws which were preserving quote-unquote traditional marriage, meaning anti-same-sex marriage, anti-civil unions affecting the LGBTQ community, reproductive and contraceptive restrictions, focusing on gender, collective bargaining, right to work, economic and labor union restrictions, and of course anti-Sharia, anti-mosque legislation targeting Muslims. And what I found was something quite interesting. In many of the states, the same usual suspects were involved in sponsoring or co-sponsoring multiple layers of legislation. So we find here in color coding, Representative Deal was a sponsor or a co-sponsor of legislation which restricts voter access, which defines marriage very narrowly, and also which restricts abortion rights in the United States. Similarly, in Michigan, we find people like Senator Meekhoff, who is involved in spearheading campaigns in voter ID, LGBTQ, and right-to-work sectors. Macmillan, similarly, in LGBTQ sectors, right-to-work, and anti-Sharia. So we find that this agenda then seems to be very coordinated. I have examples here of Oklahoma, which was the first state to have a anti-Sharia legislation passed. Fortunately, it was blocked by federal court as being unconstitutional. And here we find an example of Tennessee. But North Carolina provides the most interesting case study. First of all, a little bit of background. North Carolina, for the first time since 1870, has majority Republican control over both of its state legislative houses, and since this year, the Republican governor as well, which gives it carte blanche to go ahead and enact whatever legislation it sees fit. It passes one of the most restrictive voter ID laws in the country. It also repeals any attempts and efforts that a death row inmate may have of asserting racial discrimination during his trial proceedings, and also ended federal employment benefits. But perhaps more egregiously was the FFFPA, which was just signed into law this year. It was touted as an anti-Sharia bill, even though it was actually a law that doesn't specifically enumerate or articulate anti-Sharia. It says that it bans foreign law from consideration by state court judges, particularly in the area of family law proceedings, divorce, alimony, child custody. But at the 11th hour, literally, at night, they also tagged on anti-abortion provisions which are seen as some of the most restrictive in the country. So with one hand, while they were trying to scare the population and cow them into resisting any opposition to the bill, they slid in an anti-abortion agenda. So we find that this coordinated effort is really manifest in the case of North Carolina. Now just a brief overview as far as looking at these 6 categories of voter ID, LGBTQ, immigration, reproductive, collective bargaining and labor, and anti-Sharia. 6 out of 6 states are the worst of the worst. They enacted legislation in all 6 areas, and you notice that North Carolina is one of them. Another 7 states only enacted 5 out of the 6. 4 out of 6, we have 7 states. 3 out of 6 categories were enacted in 8 states. 4 when it comes to 2 out of 6. And we have 10 which only enacted 1 restrictive area of legislation, and 6 which were completely clean. There were no restrictive laws that were passed in these 6 states vis-a-vis the categories. As far as the observations that we find, among the 22 most restrictive states, those which had passed within each one of them 4 or more categories of restrictive laws, all of them have, coincidentally, Republican-controlled or Republican-leaning state legislatures. For those states with minimal levels of restrictive legislation, 1 to 2 areas of laws passed, generally the focus was on the issue of the definition of marriage, more traditionally, and on trying to regulate voter access with voter ID requirements. None of the states that recognized same-sex marriage proposed a ban on Sharia. Iowa and New Jersey attempted anti-Sharia laws, but in each of those cases it had to do with some internal politics within the Republican parties more than it had to do with any kind of manifest anti-Islamic agenda. All 14 states that have passed or attempted to pass anti-immigration laws also passed anti-Sharia laws. So there's definitely a nexus between the xenophobia behind anti-immigration laws and how they perceive Muslims and their desire to do something about it. What it also shows, though, is that the legislative efforts are clearly coordinated. The anti-Muslim efforts are by the same politicians within each state who are targeting other groups. Now, the conclusions that I found were that the anti-Muslim legislative agenda is not in isolation. It is situated within this broader context of anti-progressive campaigns. So the good news is that they don't only hate Muslims. The bad news is they hate a lot of people. The Tea Party conservative Christians have been spearheading an anti-progressive legislative agenda, which is anti-LGBTQ, racial, anti-immigrant, anti-abortion, anti-labor union, and anti-Muslim. So the question that I was left with is, are Muslims then perceived as part of a bigger other? Has this been a process that confirms the otherization of Muslims? Or does it ironically make Muslims the uber self? If one takes an examination, as we were discussing yesterday, and Saeed was also discussing this, the displacement of all negative tropes, we find then that Muslims have served the purpose of becoming the ultimate folk devil. Everything then is displaced into them. The ultimate homophobes, the ultimate racists, the ultimate, ironically, anti-immigrants, the ultimate anti-women, and maybe in some cases among the more neoliberal Muslims, anti-labor union. In essence, what has happened is that the Muslims have become a reflection of the worst of the categories of those who are trying to reverse the process of America's majority-minority demographic shift. If Muslims are the uber self, then the Tea Party has positioned itself as being the real and authentic self. Quite ironic, given the fact that as they further disenfranchise and disempower Muslims, the only ones that are left to blame are themselves. Thank you.